Good morning, everybody. We are up to chapter 10 in HaYichud. And before I speak, I'd like to say a few words. So just a review of a conceptual idea that's distinctive to HaYichud. Hopefully everyone recalls that the Alter Rebbe's initial strategy was actually to publish HaYichud first, and then the Sefer Shel Beinanim. You remember what we call Tanya is actually a compilation of a few different writings. And they were initially published independently, and it was a relatively recent phenomena, like 100 years ago, that they started to publish them as one unit. Now, the concept behind, or the strategy behind printing the Shaar Yichud V'Amunah first, was that you would think that before we can learn about serving Hashem, we have to know who Hashem is. But then the Alter Rebbe sort of reconfigured it and said, well, you know what, we are so anxious to get to the service part that even if we don't exactly understand who Hashem is, we have just a general awareness, well, we can go to the service. So that's the Sefer Shel Beinanim, is how to serve Hashem, how to align oneself with Hashem, how to be connected with Hashem, all of the things that we have talked about in the first section of Tanya. The Shaar Yichud V'Amunah is more about Hashem himself. You know, when we say Hashem, what do we mean? And so on. So on the one hand, we acknowledge, of course, that we will never know Hashem, and yet we are obligated to be in endless and continuous pursuit of Hashem. So there's this push me, pull me back and forth. That is one of the things that some people were not so happy about with Hasidus. They didn't like it, is because they made Hashem almost too knowable, too finite. And of course, the alternative is that if you say Hashem is infinite, well, infinite is also a certain form of a limitation. He's only infinite. So how do we sort of try to understand Hashem and realize that we can never understand Hashem? How do we reach for Hashem and yet say that you can never be connected with Hashem? So we do a lot of this back and forth. On the one hand, we'll have a chapter where we explain about Hashem, and then, as we talked about in the last chapter, it begins with this hard break, but Aval, that's how the last chapter began, what we just described doesn't really apply to Hashem. And we go a little bit back and forth about this sort of tension between the two ideas. So in the previous parak, we talked about that Hashem is as distant and non-capturable in the spheres as Chachma is from Asiyah. You may recall the line, it's associated with the last week's parsha, that if you would say you can't hold an idea in your hand, everybody would laugh at that, because of course ideas can't be held physically in a person's hand. No one would even consider that. Well, this is similar absurdity to suggest that you can't understand Hashem. Well, who would even imagine that you could? The contrast is not just quantitatively distant, it's completely of a different sort. The connection between, or the disconnect between the infinity of Hashem and the limited capacity of human intellect. So we went on to describe a lot of this idea. And here in this chapter, we're going to return to a mashal that we introduced earlier about the sun and the sun rays, the sun and the sun globe. Now, there's a nuance in Hebrew that can become a little confusing. In English, we say, turn on the light, and the light emits light. You know, the lamp emits light, but we call the lamp a light too. So you could get confused between them. So it's an important term to remember that in Hebrew, there are two words. There is the ma'or, which is the source of light, and there is or, which is light. So in English, we use them both. We tend to use the word light to mean both the light fixture and the light that is emanated from the fixture. But in Hebrew, there's two separate words. So we may revisit that a few times because it could become confusing. So the mashal that we have already mentioned, and we're going to revisit it again, is about the sun and the sunlight. Now, the concept that we've talked about until now is that if I go outside and I see a sun ray on the sidewalk, I see it as being something that is identifiable. I see it, it's there and it's not there. So I can measure its heat, I can measure its light, I can measure its impact. But really, if I were to be able to trace that sun ray all the way back to the globe of the sun, it would disappear because it doesn't have innate identity. Its identity is only when it becomes separated. This is repeated. Every parent knows this. It's repeated in Torah, Lech Lecha, that in order for Avram to become Avram, in order for him to become the person that he is destined to be or has the capacity to be, he has to go away. A child has to go to school, and that separation anxiety and the crying and the screaming, and sometimes the kids get upset too, is about this sense of separation and detachment that is necessary in order for the child to come out of the shadow of the parent. And we talk about this, we know it in Torah, it's a very difficult thing to be raised when your father or your mother is the tzaddik or the tzaddikis, and so on. How do you find your identity? We could borrow a little modern psychology and say, well, of course, Yitzchak had to be Gevura because his father was Chesed. If Yitzchak was just going to be Chesed, he'd be subsumed like the sun ray in the sun globe. Concurrently, we say that you don't rebel against, he's not rebelling against his father by being Gevura. It's not a detachment simply for the sake of detachment. And ultimately, like we see with Avram, the end of last week's parsha, not to harp on it, but just to illustrate the point, that he also was Gevura, and he was willing to take his son up to be slaughtered. So he had a Gevura quality. It was less developed. It was less necessary in his circumstance, and so his son picked up on it. Anyway, back to the point that's relevant to what we're discussing. Hashem and his attributes are all one. That is, the sun ray is part of the actual sun. So every aspect of Hashem is the entirety of Hashem. Again, Ein Od Milvado, there's nothing else besides Hashem. Doesn't just mean there isn't another God besides God, like there's only one book on the table. It means that everything is an expression of the non-thing, of the infinity of Hashem. Now, this is crucial to the mashal and the back and forth. And again, whenever you have a mashal, every mashal is ultimately imperfect and breaks down. Otherwise, it's just a redundancy. So a mashal highlights a certain aspect of the concept that allows us access to the idea, but eventually it becomes exhausted. It runs out. And it's this idea, again, that all the attributes of Hashem are absolutely one and have no identity. And this is what we talked about, that we have to be very cautious. We should not say that Hashem is Chesed. We say that Hashem chooses to align himself with Chesed. Hashem is the source of Chesed. But if we were to say that Hashem is Chesed, we would be limiting Hashem. As the Alter Rebbe is going to write here in chapter 10, if we were to say that will and wisdom, Ratzah and Chachma, Chesed, Gevura were the absolute identity of Hashem, then we would be putting a limit on Hashem. Then we'd be saying that Hashem is everything, that is a compilation of things, like a machine is a compilation of many parts, but each part is absolutely crucial. If you pulled the part out, you wouldn't have it anymore. And our emphasis, which we talked about at the end of the parak, that it can't be understood with human seichel, was even Hashem and the spheros are incomparable. So when we use these terms, and we talked about them, remember the idea about metaphors, they're not just to be discarded, but this is this very delicate balance that the Alter Rebbe walks. When we use terms to say that Hashem aligns himself with Chesed, we might be tempted to say, oh, so Hashem is Chesed. Rabbi Shais Taub tells a story that he was once on a panel with the other clergy, and they were asked to give their definition of God. And everybody else defined God as he's the creator, he's the sustainer, he rewards, he punishes. And Rabbi Taub's point was, you're limiting Hashem to seeing it through your eyes, like we always talk about, the child who defines the parent by what they do for them. And on the one hand, it's true and it's necessary, because infinite is very exciting, but I don't know what it is, so it doesn't have any real tangible meaning to me. It's like telling me how many moons orbit around a planet. Okay, I believe you, and I even believe you that it has some great impact on the tides and so on, but it's so distant from me as to have essentially no real meaning. So we have to break it down. But what happens when we break it down? We start to think, okay, now I got it. And if we think now I got it, we are missing the infinity. Okay, so chapter 10, and it begins again with this hard break. You recall that in the Sefer Shal Beinanim, we continuously pointed out how the chapters began with Vav. And it was these streams, these themes that went for 5 chapters, 7 chapters, 9 chapters, and it'd be a little bit of a curve, not a hard turn, but a curve. In Shaar HaYichud V'Amunah, where the Alter Rebbe is constantly engaged in this sort of back and forth, this metronomic sense of we can understand Hashem, we can't understand Hashem, we find these much harsher, more deliberate breaks between point and point. So here we go. However, which is a strong breaking point. Mikol Makai, nevertheless, despite the fact that we have just described how we can't understand Hashem and how the spheroids are beyond our sense of them being hard, rigid slots of absolute chesed, and as we discussed, how they interact with one another, and so on. Again, not to harp too much, but it was the parsha. Avram is chesed in the beginning of the parsha, and he's gevura at the end of the parsha. The parsha opens, he's welcoming guests, and he's defending the Sodom, and the end of the parsha, he's bringing his son up to the slaughter. And the malachim are very rigid. They only do their task. The malach of healing can only heal. The malach of destruction can only destroy. They have no flexibility. They have no fluidity. They only do what they're slotted to do. So we've just finished describing how we cannot have any true grasp or understanding of the infinity of Hashem. Mikol Makom, nevertheless, this is a phrase that we have seen before, that Torah speaks in the language of human beings. And we recognize it. God said, God's hand, God thought, God decided, etc. So since Torah uses human terminology in the description of Hashem, since Torah describes Hashem and allows us to describe Hashem in human terms, so this gives us permission to do the same. But it is only, we have to remember, to make it palpable to the ear. I mean, there isn't really an English term that's comparable to this idea, to soften the ear. But what it means is it makes it something that we can understand. So again, this is that very delicate balancing act that we have to be so careful about. Torah allows us, so when Torah says the hand of Hashem, it doesn't mean a 5-fingered fleshy thing with opposable thumbs. We might say this isn't even really a hand. This helps us understand what a true hand is. The hand of Hashem splits the sea. What's a hand? Well, this becomes the insight. But what do? We do it upside down. We think this is a hand, and that Hashem has got something else. Why? Because we are a little self-absorbed, and we assume that we are real, and then we use ourselves to understand Hashem. Imagine if we could reflip it, what we call HaYichud Ilah. We could see things from Hashem's perspective, that a hand splits seas. And this is a manifestation of what a hand is. It would be, but still, again, either way, it allows us to have some sense of an understanding. And again, this is driven by Hashem's desire to be connected in a what we would call a relationship with creation, and not to be so detached as to us just go, okay, I don't know what to do about that, but okay, which is not really going to, quote, be of any value to us. It's just going to be, we're just going to have to accept it. This becomes our permission to use these types of terms. so that we can hear it. And we talk a lot about the difference between seeing and hearing. It's actually today's HaYichud. When we say Shema, so of course we cover our eyes because we want to hear and not see. When we see something, we get distracted by it. That's all of advertising. When we see it, it looks delicious, we want it, and we don't listen as closely. So when we cover our eyes, we can listen a little bit more. Curiously, just in today's HaYichud, it says that Shema, the word Shema, is an acronym for the pasuk, lift up your eyes. Because what happens, our eyes tend to see the very tangible. And our desire for further investigation becomes short-circuited because I see it. See what I mean? This type of thing. But when we listen, we allow it to truly penetrate, cover our eyes, and so on. So this is that term. Therefore, and here the Alter Rebbe, this is all about, like, how can you even suggest that we could talk about Hashem? It's unknowable, it's infinite, it's that kind of indescribable. But it says, Niten Rishus l'chachmei emes. Permission is given to the scholars of truth. We'll talk about that in a moment. L'daber b'sfiros b'derech mashal, to speak about the spheres again in the path of a mashal. Like we talk about the sun rays and the sun, even though they're incomparable, even though one sun ray within the intensity of the sun is completely without any identity, and yet we're allowed to talk about it, just like we can say it is accurate to say, there's the sun. Words that we use that are so rigidly locked down are acceptable. We talk about knowing as an example. I mean, even in the secular idea, we say beyond a reasonable doubt. It doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's probably true. I mean, in Torah, if we have two witnesses come and attest to some crime, and we interrogate them, and their stories match up perfectly, does it mean they're telling the truth? It doesn't mean that. I mean, it's possible that they could have deceived us, right? But we're going to go with it. At some point, we are going to accept their statement as being what we're going to call true, even though it's possible that they just tricked us. Yeah, right. But at some point, I mean, there's a letter from the Rebbe where the Rebbe talks about, how do we know that God exists and believing in God? And the Rebbe says, look, a person can say, I don't believe anything to be true. Right? I don't believe that the world is round, and I don't believe that George Washington was the first president, and I don't believe that water boils at 212 degrees. You could say that, and I can't really argue with you about that. But that would just be a total absurdity. The Rebbe uses the English word absurd. So if you're going to accept anything as factual, historically, empirically, scientifically, that same skill set will bring you to the recognition of the infinity of Hashem. So again, here, we are allowed to use it and understand it, and again, understand it that it is only a mashal. It is only a method, like, remember the word mashal means to dominate, like moshel. It allows us to put our arms around a concept to how we can get to the ultimate sense of what we don't know. We can describe them as, and again, here's where that little grammatic point is important, lights. Now remember, there's the light source and the light that comes from it. This is the word or, which is the light that emanates from the light. Just a reminder, in English, we call the light fixture the light, and we call the light it emanates light. So it gets a little confusing. But in Hebrew, there's two very distinctive words. On the fourth day of creation, God created the two great me'oros, translated sometimes as luminaries, the source of light, the sun and the moon. The light that we get is the expression of that light. So here we say, we're talking about that we can call them lights. Meaning, why should we say, I see the sunlight? We see the sun. And that the closer we get to the sun, the less significant the sunlight becomes. This is why, again, just a cultural experience of this. This is why the animal soul becomes frantic as the person becomes closer and closer to the infinity of Hashem. because it's such a closeness, it's such an intensity to the infinity of Hashem that the animal soul becomes frightened that he's going to be lost. It's a total bittul, and that total bittul causes this very harsh reaction. Again, maybe observed it as a person is coming closer and closer to Hashem. They go, whoa, 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 1 second. I'm forgetting who I am, right? That's the form of bittul. We would say you're discovering who you truly are, which is not the things that you have defined yourself of the human and the physical. When the animal soul gets very panicked. What do you mean? I've made my whole life around this humanity characteristic. All right. So we continue. Today, Shaidei Hamashal Hazeh Yuvan Lana Tzas Inyan HaYichud Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Midaisa Shehu B'derech Mashal. So what is the point of this mashal? And this is the important thing to recognize. The crucial, central piece is that the function of the mashal is to allow us, and look what the Alter Rebbe says here, a little bit of understanding. Inyan ksas, a little tiny bit, and the word ksas, I mean, there's different words for small. There's ma'at, a little, whatever, but the word ksas means like the very edge. In the point of a yud, we've demonstrated this before, but if you look at a mezuzah, there's a little tiny point above the yud. That's called the koitz. So koitz means the teeniest little point where two come together. So this is even tinier than the word we might say, the more common word for a little in Hebrew, which is ma'at. This is the just the teeniest point of understanding. And again, at risk of being dismissed as, well, that's it. Who cares about that? That's so insignificant. That kind of character. Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and again, we've talked about that, Kadosh and Baruch. And this is what we're doing. We're striving to understand it. There is a saying, I don't know what the source of it is, it's not a Torah saying specifically, but I think it supports the concepts in Torah, that a child becomes an adult when they realize that their parent is a person. Now, one way of understanding that is very simplistic. A child thinks their parent is perfect. When they realize their parent is imperfect, they now suddenly have to be elevated to a sense of maturity. All of a sudden, they can do something for their parent that their parent couldn't do. They can reach the higher shelf. They can carry the heavy package, whatever it is. That's at one level. But at another level, it means when they truly start to understand their parent, instead of just having this very detached sense that, well, my parent is, Superman, or just can do everything and do anything. Not because they understand their parent's weakness, but they truly start to understand their parent as a person. So a little bit this is what the Alter Rebbe is talking about in the service of Hashem. Now, again, we might see, and the animal soul says, oh, you see, Hashem doesn't do what I like, or he's imperfect, whatever. That's one bad path that this could take, which is one of the reasons why some people were not so down with Chassidus. But the upside is we start to truly understand, again, how Hashem operates. Now, again, a parent is still ultimately a person and is ultimately limited and is ultimately imperfect. But getting to know Hashem doesn't mean that we get to know his imperfections. It's like we talk about that Hashem wants a welcoming place down here in this world. So in our secular society, we tend to think that this means that Hashem doesn't have to put on a show. That we imagine that somebody of stature, which we used to say, great politicians, I don't want to get distracted, that, when they come home at night, they kick their shoes off and they're just like everybody else. But what we mean, so maybe that's what Hashem means by dir b'tachtonim. He doesn't have to always be on call. But that's incorrect. There's an analogy. I'll give you a quick story because, like my friend says, Lubavitchers always have to have the Lubavitch commercial, right? So what Rabbi Krinsky, who lived me well, he was the Rebbe's secretary. the only one who's still with us. He should live and be well. Anyway, he was here in Chicago once, and we had a little farbrengen. So I asked him, and he drove the Rebbe to the oil hundreds of times and would come. And I asked him if he ever saw the Rebbe sort of in a more casual form. I forget exactly how I phrased it. So, like all the Rebbe secretaries, he doesn't answer. And instead, he turns to the question, what do you think? Which means I'm not going to tell you. But that's the point, meaning we tend to think that in public, we put on our best show. But then in private, we could be lazy. But with Hashem, with tzaddikim, it's the opposite. In public, we have to act like the way that the public can understand us. We have to conduct ourselves in a way that the public can understand us. But ourselves, then we can truly be at the holiest of levels. Then we can truly, really express ourselves and not have to modify it around our around the public and the community. So when Hashem expresses himself to us, and again, back to that story of Rabbi Taub, if we think that Hashem is most identified by his creation, so then we think that the greatest thing about Hashem is he created something from nothing. But what's less great about Hashem? Whatever. But if we see it the opposite, the most pedestrian, I don't mean that it's in any way fantastic, but the most pedestrian thing Hashem does, kulam b'chachma asisa, that what we think of as the highest is actually just like a simple behavior, then we understand that there's something far more infinite, truly, about Hashem than what we see. So instead of seeing and saying, that's all you got, you created the world, we see the opposite. What sort of, I don't want to call it least significant because this is starting to become like it's a competition, but the least impressive thing that Hashem does, the least infinite thing Hashem does, is create the world. So then this gives us a little bit of an inkling of what true infinity means. And thus the limit of what the world is and our capacity to rise above it through engaging the Chacham and all the things that we've talked about. So this is the point that the Alter Rebbe is making here. We're getting a little bit of an insight by Hashem giving us something that is somewhat palpable for us. Like we find again with the light, that one sunlight, as it is relative to all of sunlight, relative to the sun globe itself, which is called the ma'or. And again, that's that grammatic point that we talked about. The source of light, while found within the sun, is absolutely subsumed within it. And that's why the Perek explains that spheres are one with Hashem, whereas before we talked about how the spheres are really separated from Hashem. So this is that sort of back and forth that we keep on talking about. We talked about how the light is, the spheres are separated slots that Hashem aligns himself with. But again, and you may remember this from last time when we used the stencil metaphor. If I have a plain black piece of paper, it doesn't, and I show it doesn't mean anything. If I put the stencil of the letter Aleph, so from my side, I just see the infinite black, but it's funneled through so that the viewer's side sees the stencil of the Aleph. If I remove the cover, boom, then you see the infinite. But I don't know what infinite is. So it appears to us that the infinite is less than the finite because the finite is tangible and practical. And the infinite is, I don't know. But that's because of our limited perspective. So, for example, in the pasuk says, "Vayikra Elikim leor yom." On the first day, Hashem created light, but it was not light that came from a source, because remember, the sun is created on the fourth day, and it says that Hashem called the light day, meaning that which is beyond the sun. That's the light that we see. We give that a name. When we give it a name, we are highlighting the chiddush, the change, this innovative point, that it is now identifiable. Now you can see something that we describe as light, and we give it a name. We name that day. But this is because of our limited perception of the occurrence. We see the light, we don't see the source of the light. So we give the light a name, an identity. So a name becomes an access point. It also becomes a parameter and a limitation. One of the concepts behind why we do not declare the name of a child before they're born, before the bris, is because a name becomes a limiting factor. And this child's going to spend the rest of his life, being limited. But we're going to let them develop. And every parent plays this game. We want the child to develop, but we want to give them guidance. You got to teach them what's right, but don't squash them. It's one of the concepts behind upsharnish. You let the child run wild till he's 3. And then now it's time to start taking on his personality and his identity. But you want to do that without squashing them. So when we call the light day, we're telling us that it now is different than darkness, which we call night. We now have separation. We now have contrast. Whereas the light that doesn't actually express itself is just the ma'or, the source of light. So we who live in a little bit, and I'll use this word, self-absorbed reality, I benefit or I appreciate light more than I do the source of light, because the light is something that I benefit from. So I give it a name, but it really has no independent identity, because if we trace it all the way back, it's subsumed in the ma'or. Again, not the heart, but it's this week's parsha. When the servant is dispatched to find the bride for Yitzchak, and he's asked, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm the servant of Avram," because I have no independent authority. I serve Avram. There's an interesting halachic question about when, in fact, does Rivka become married to Yitzchak? So is it when Eliezer makes the connection because he is the agent, or is it only when she comes back and Yitzchak himself marries her? Because a person can contract a marriage through an agent. So if the agent is completely subsumed, meaning he has no identity, but we give them identity because these are the things that we can attach ourselves to. If we look around in life, how many different jobs are support for something else? They're not the job itself. There's ultimately a buyer and a seller. There's an exchange of product, and there's 17 different hands that it has to pass through until it gets there. So there is some process that requires all of these different steps along the way. But if they forget that they're ultimately a buyer and a seller, then they lose the entire process. It's not to say that what they do is not significant and crucial, but they have to understand that it's part of an entire process, from product to customer. All right. So back here in the text. Vaziva nitzutz hamaspashin and meir mimenu nikraor kamashakos v'ikulikimar yoim. And so the source is called the ma'or, the light that comes out from that we see and we can point to and we can identify. We call that the light, the or. It's a little bit like we have with a rainbow. The rainbow isn't a substantive entity. We can point to it. We make the bracha on it and so on. But it's sunlight coming through the clouds that produces on our side of the equation this visible phenomena that we can identify and commemorate and so forth. When the light is in the origin, in the ma'or, in the sun ball, it has no identity. Ein sham rak etzem echad shu guf ha'ma'or ha'meir. Keziv or shem sham etzem echad mamashim guf ha'ma'or ha'meir. Ve'ein lo shum mitzias klal b'fnei atzma. Now we recognize this in what I call the sort of the social sense, that when my light is in the origin, it has no identity. Now we are trained from Hasidus to say, great. But the animal soul says, I'm not going near that. I don't want to go near that. I don't want to lose what my identity is. And this is why, again, at the social level, we may have observed it. The person starts coming, they love it, it's great. And then all of a sudden they go, whoa, I'm not doing that anymore. Why not? I don't even recognize myself anymore. Well, we would argue because you've been identifying yourself by your humanity. If you would identify yourself by your neshama, you would see that this is affirming you who you truly are. The first thing, are you Jewish? Meaning, will you identify yourself by your neshama? When they came to Yoina and they said, what is your name and what is your occupation? In other words, tell us about yourself by telling us what you do for a living. His response is, I'm a Jew and I fear Hashem. That's who I am. Yes, it's true that I am an accountant or a doctor and I live in this neighborhood, but all of those things are about what essentially make me separated from Hashem. And my mission is to see that they are one with Hashem. So the animal soul, which is obsessed with its own survival, is terrified of coming so close to the infinity of Hashem, because that will result, and it will, in the forfeiture of his independent identity. And he wants to be the Metzius. And again, if our greatest, if we presume the greatest accomplishment of Hashem is that he created the world, then anything that makes the world seem less significant might seem to make Hashem less significant. And so we're desperately clinging to the animal soul is desperately clinging to its sense of self. But as we get closer and closer to the infinity of Hashem, Eved Avram Anochi, I am a servant of Abraham. But it's a very difficult, sort of what we would use, I guess, the word psychological process to get my arms around that. That's like scary stuff. I'm afraid of that. So what happens? Ukidvarim ha'ela mamish v'yesim mizeh hemideso shal kadosh baruch hu v'ratzoyne v'chachmasai boilem ha'atzilis imahusu v'atzmusa kaviyachol ha'mislabish b'seichem. And this concept of the loss of individual identity of the sun ray in the sun is even many more fold, biggest, toppest, mostest, uppest, billion, zillion, trillion of the loss of the individual midah of Hashem within the infinity of Hashem. That becomes completely subsumed within Hashem in the world of Atzilus. This becomes lost in the Atzilus level. Remember the 4 worlds, 4 stages of awareness. The most profound stage of awareness of godliness is in Atzilus, which is consumed with Hashem, the word meaning next to. So a total surrender of his identity. So too, as the midos, which we think of as individuated, come closer and closer to the infinite of Hashem, they lose their identity. So here again, it's this constant back and forth, but not exactly like that. So now that we've explained that it's like that, and it's even more than that, but it's not exactly like that, because we're always going back and forth. So we have this tendency, well, which one is it? Up, down, right, left. We're still not hitting it, because again, whatever we're going to say, it's never going to work out. So we have, humanity has this tendency to want everything to line up like a nice, perfect little slots, square pegs and square holes, round pegs and round holes. Everything's got to be lined up perfectly. And anything that doesn't, we just dismiss as a bunch of hooey. Why? Because we have made scholarship the absolute affirmation of all. Science. What does science say? Of course, we say, well, who's science? And then people get very angry. What do you mean science? Well, who's science? So if we live in a world where we are consumed with everything lining up, a nice, perfect little ducks in a row, then, excuse me, then we become frustrated by anything that can't be mastered, and thus we dismiss it as nonsense. Again, there was a time, and it's also of a Gashmis level, but there was a time when poetry and art were considered like greater gifts. Today, maybe it's a very American phenomena. What does it do? What is the point? An analogy, just for a moment. I once heard an interview with one of the original astronauts. I forget which one. And they asked him, like, what are we spending billions and billions of dollars about this for? Like, who cares? And he said, something again at a human level. He said, well, human beings should be curious. There's a great value in curiosity. The other argument is, well, what do you mean? You can't have GPS? So how do we validate all pursuits? Is it because it builds a better mousetrap? So we should spend billions of dollars so that we can have Google Maps. Or do we say, no, there's a value in just the infinite and the pursuit of the infinite? So Torah, tells us very much we ought to be practical, etc. But what we're saying here is that when we get beyond the practical, we have a tendency to sort of dismiss that, get frustrated by it because we can't understand it. And the Alter Rebbe is telling us that's where we start to become aligned with the infinite. Well, why do you like it? Why is it good? Why should it? Prove it to me? And so on. Which, of course, is not worthless, but it's not really how we run our lives. We don't just live based on prove it to me. We go with what people tell us. We go with our intuition, etc. Okay. So here we go. Nevertheless, again, there's that phrase, to soften the ears, meaning it shouldn't land harsh on our ears. Nishma v'nizbein mimashal or hashemesh hamiyuchad abaltamim kairei v'en oile b'shem klal v'fnei atzmai rak shem amakra levadei. We concentrate on, we focus on, we look at the sunlight that is completely subsumed within its origin, has no identity of its own. It's only identified, again, Eved Avram Anochi, I am a servant of Avram, by the name of its source. Kach, so too, Kol Midas Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu. Ritzayne Chachmasai, Einan Oilis V'Nikras B'Shemus Elu Klal. Elu Lagabi HaNevroim El Yenim V'Tachteinim Shaviyusam V'Chiyusam V'Hanagasam Shad Kadosh Baruch Hu. Mahavo Machai Oisam Umanhigam Hu B'Ritzayne V'Chachmasai Hu Binasai V'Daitai Hamaslabshais B'Midas HaKedusha Kedisa B'Medrash. So that's a long line, but let's go back and revisit it. So to the midos of Hashem, the spheros, the characteristics of Hashem, and what is Hashem's rotzain and what is his wisdom, do not have any name at all. The names are only from our perspective. I mean, we use this idea about names in general. A name is not for myself. It's like a phone number. I need a phone number so someone else can contact me, not for myself. So the name is not the true identity, but it's an access point for others who can reach beyond me. Again, I mean, imagine you call your best friend. You don't even have to say your name; they know who you are. If your child calls you and says, "Hi, Mom, it's me. I used to live in your house. Remember?" Like, the name in that context only creates a sense of separation, not a sense of unification. Because if we were unified, you wouldn't have to have my name. They tell a story, maybe it's true or apocryphal. These two peasants were drinking and they're drunk. And one guy says to him, I love you. The other guy says, if you love me, tell me what's bothering me. Meaning, if we're so one, there shouldn't be any separation. So names are very useful and practical, but they're a form of separation, a form of distance. When we are absolutely unified, we don't have to have a name. So it's completely counterintuitive because, like in the Tower of Babel, their obsession is, let us make a name for ourselves. This pursuit of making a name for myself is about affirming the Nefesh HaBahamis, affirming my animalistic character. What's the greatest goal of the neshama is to not have a name, is to not be identified, is to not be particularized, is to be so one that I don't have to have a name. I'm just sort of naturally blended into this unit. Like I've talked about this before, when do we start to notice things? When they don't work, I give you a bracha, you should never notice your internal organs. We start noticing our teeth when they hurt. We start noticing the engine when it's not working. We start noticing the computer when there's a problem. So we don't want to notice. I don't want to notice. I just want it to function. So here, think about the animal soul. What is the animal soul's desire? To make a name for itself, that everyone should remember my name, and so on. And here we have a superior level that is only the way that Hashem conducts the world, the way the beneficiary who is being orchestrated by God's passion, by his wisdom, by his understanding, by his knowledge, that invests in all of these midos. Kedisa b'medrash, like the Medrash says, Basara dvarim nivra elam. The world is created by 10 statements. You recognize that. It's recorded in Pirkei Avos. God said, there's 10 of those. Bereshis being the first. God said, let there be like God said. 10 statements. And now it explains, what does that mean? The 10 midos. B'chachma, tvuna, that's bina, das, v'chulu. So when we say the world was created with 10 statements, we mean that the world was created through the 10 spheres. Each of the spheres manifesting a different aspect. So we pull apart and we highlight one separated from the other, because we need that as human beings. We need to have tangible portals of entry. But essentially what we're arguing is that the world was created by all at once, and then individual parts identified thereafter. So here's the chart, which I'm sorry that people didn't get. They didn't get. So the order of creation. So these are the 7 midos. The first day is light. Light is the midah of chesed. Remember, the midos are without morality. There's not like good midos and bad midos. The midos are like tools, what you use them for. So generosity is the positive side of chesed. Spoiling, sure, kid, have all the lollipops you want, no limits. Abraham is the best example, and so on. Separation the second day, no mention of good. Gevura, discipline is the proper one. Harsh withholding. Here, I'll email this out when I send a recording, and so on. So here you have each of the days of creation is a representation, is a manifestation of one of those midos. But essentially what we're arguing is that it was all created the first, and then it's pulled out. Just like a person develops their life, a person is born, God willing, healthy, then their whole life is about developing. And we go from infinite to finite. There's that infinite potential, which is truly infinite, because whatever, everyone's born. Every creation is starting to put shape and character and nuance around it. The Chsiv, back in the Tanya, like it says, Hashem b'chachma yisad aretz. Hashem with chachma, which is as infinite as we can get, because remember, chachma is not about how brilliant it works, but about the capacity to imagine the infinite. Koinein shamayim b'tfuna v'daitoi tohoimas niboku. The heavens and the earth with wisdom and knowledge reach down to the bottom. Like we say on Erev Shabbos and Pasuk Eliyahu, the Pikas esetikuna and Bekrinli essence fidden, that Hashem has dispatched these 10 orders, tikkuns, arrangements, processes, particulars. And again, it's useful for us. These are useful processes. These are limits that we need, because infinite is like overflowing, it's like a flood. Gloyas Gallion, 10 hidden concepts that are not revealed. And Hashem is contained within them. Now, this statement that the world is created through 10 processes or 10 spheres are listed out in the Gemara. So just to read through them, which you recognize. So it's Chachma, which is the concept. Bina, starting to make particulars about it. Das is when it's understood so intensely that I can communicate it even to the non-naturally aligned. And the greatest disconnect is between the intellect and the impulse. You have what is called Koyach, the infinite power, which we call Chesed, Gevura, which is orderliness, Ga'ara, which is rebuke, said that justice, Mishpat, judgment, Chesed, Rachamim, these are counted out in the Gemara. This is not something that's unique to Chassidus. They are counted out in the Gemara. And again, the concept being that Hashem aligns himself with these characteristics to give us tangible handles to be able to have some form of discussion at risk that we start to think, oh yeah, that's the entirety. I got it. I understand. I know everything about God. When in actuality, they are designed to open us up to the infinity of Hashem. Al derech mashal, for example, b'yom rishon mishes yimei bereishis niglas midas hachesed klum mikol midas v'akadoshis v'ratzoynoi v'chachmasai. So again, back to our little chart here for a moment. On the first day, Hashem creates light. That's chesed, generosity, no limits. And from there, you can start having all of them. That's why it's first. I mean, remember, these are a vertical line, not just a horizontal line. It's the first that leads into the second. How do you know, for example, Gevura, which can sometimes come across as just being harsh? The parent, every kid says, you won't give me all the lollipops I want. How do you know if your Gevura is a healthy Gevura? When it's predicated on Chesed. So Chesed is the first of all of them that opens them all up. That are all invested within them. His Ratzain, his Chachma. Again, Ratzain is the ultimate objective. And that is all contained within the idea of light. B'maimer, like it says, Yehi Or, there should be light. Now, light is identifiable. Light is not darkness, but it's not defined to something particular. So yes, light is a form of infinite. There's different characteristics of infinite. There's infinite numbers, but numbers are not letters. Light is not darkness. So we are scaling down, Hashem is scaling down the infinite so that we can come down to humans through the whole process of Ishtalshalis. So essentially we can work backwards, and instead of seeing the infinite and the finite as incompatible, we start to see them as perfectly intertwined. This is the expression of the light that comes down into the world from that which is above it. And it spreads out to the world from one end to the next. Which is the characteristic that we call chesed. Remember, the word chesed, although we translate it as kindness, isn't about an action, and it isn't about, it doesn't have any innate morality. It's about the capacity for limitlessness. So just like we say the apple is sweet and that person is sweet, that there is a corollary of the concept of sweetness, so too chesed is an access point for us to the infinity of Hashem. And Gevura is there. Like we said, the first day, it's all there. It just needs to be parceled out. That's how we know that Yitzchak looked exactly like Avram, right? We recognize that from the Pasuk, even though Avram was Chesed and Yitzchak was Gevura. Now, Esav was also Gevura, and he looked very different because Esav was just Gevura. And Yitzchak was Gevura, the product of Chesed. Just like a parent. At first, when the child's an infant, you got to be total Chesed. And then you got to start introducing Gevura. It's a Gevura born of Chesed. So when a Gevura is born of Chesed, it looks like Chesed. So Yitzchak looks like Avram. When Gevura is just plain old Gevura, that I'm strong and you're weak, then it looks like Esau. And again, every step down, it's a little less infinite. And that lesser infinity can even come to, well, where's God? I don't see God. I see the table. And we start to affirm the physical and speculate on the spiritual. And again, Shaar HaYichud B'Amunah, we might summarize its goal is to flip it around and say that I know that God exists, and then we'll speculate about whether or not I exist. As opposed to our animal soul's tendency that what I can see, touch, and feel is real, even about God. So I say that God's the creator and God split the seas, etc. And that's it. That's what God is. And that's God's greatest accomplishment, instead of seeing that as the most pedestrian. And it even can be invested in this physical world, which is still a limited creation. Even though it says that it's a 500-year journey from the world, from earth to the heavens and east to west, but it's 500, it's not infinite. It's still a limited number. What happens on the second day of creation? Back to our chart for a moment. What happens on the second day of creation? Hashem creates separation. Now, even Hashem can't find anything positive to say about it. Introduces the characteristic of Gevura. Midas Gevura, Klum Yishar Midas for its, which again, it's a Gevura that's born of Chesed. That's why Yitzchak looks like Abraham, and it's a Gevura that begets Tiferes Yaakov. So again, clear sign of godliness is cooperation. A clear sign of ungodliness is my way or the highway. So the Gevura, that's the product of Chesed, looks like Chesed, and begets a healthy sense of Tiferes. So in our sort of secular Freudian world, we'd say, well, Yitzchak rebelled against Abraham. Abraham was Chesed and Yitzchak wasn't. And Yaakov rebelled against Yitzchak because Yitzchak was Tiferes and Yaakov was Gevura and Abraham was Chesed. But now we understand it's the contrary, because it's not that Abraham was Chesed. I am the servant of Hashem. Now Hashem needs Chesed. I manifest as Chesed, like we talked about. He welcomes in the three strangers who he suspects worship the dirt on their feet. Hashem needs him to be Gevura. He's Gevura. And therefore he begets the next son. The son says, okay, what does the world need now? Now it needs Gevura. Now it needs Tiferes. So there is a vertical cooperative sequence in the godly midos. In the ungodly midos, it's all the spheres going in their own direction without any cooperation. This is the concept of tikkun and toyu. That doesn't talk about it here in this parak, but it's another concept that you may be familiar with. Ubara bahar rakia, that's why it created the atmosphere. Like it says in the pasuk that he created this barrier and he separated out between the waters to conceal the waters in the heavens, the clouds, from the waters on the earth and the puddles. And again, that separation is for us. So we think we want the infinite, but it's a little scary. By days that it's what allows there to be the tangibility, the physicality of this world, which we need. So again, everybody wants to allow their child to flow and allow their talents to develop. But if you don't give the kid piano lessons, he's never going to be able to be a piano player. So say, my child is a piano player. Do you give him piano lessons? I don't want to restrict him. But again, it's still filled with chesed, because this is the healthy sense of the interaction between the spheros. The world is built on chesed. Because otherwise, if there's no separation, the world is 70% water. We become consumed by it, overwhelmed. Tzedek Yehudin, Mishpat Ihurachmi, Kulo La'achsa Eches Tanek Alma. This is what Eliyahu says in the Pasuk Eliyahu, that when we have this sort of battle, so to speak, between Chesed and Gevura, to see that they're really all one and the same. That Tzedek is Mishpat. They're all interacting and functioning together. Avolav the Islay Tzedek Yediyah the Iyudin v'loy Mishpat Yediyah the Iyarachmi v'lam mikol inami this klal. But Hashem is not any of those things. Hashem is not the midah of justice. Hashem is not that midah. Hashem and Elokim are all one and the same. So again, the objective, Hashem and Elokim, in fact, in the story about the battle between Eliyahu and the prophets of Baal. So the point that Eliyahu declares is Hashem hu Elokim, meaning it's not just a trivial battle between the prophet of Hashem and idolatry. It's the conceptual idea between Hashem and the forces of nature being ascribed their own identity. I mean, it's the classic. This is the real world. This idea that there's somehow separation. So what we have seen is that the spheres, when they function in harmony, one begets the other. I mean, back to the creation story for a quick moment. The last day of creation is when it is Tov Ma'od. It is Malchus. It is the incorporation of all of those characteristics. It's that idea that everything manifests itself together in the service of Hashem, which is why we find that every day Hashem said it is good. And on Friday, he said it's Tov Ma'od, it's very good. Now, very good is not just gooder than good. It means the interfunctionality or the cooperation between them. They all come together to form something greater than just their individual parts. So the sphere, so what we start to identify, we say, oh, this is light. So now you see how this could lead, without this proper understanding, like the Alter Rebbe used that kind of harsh language, those who deny the truth way back, like in chapter 1, we call the people who don't understand this koifrim. I mean, it's like pretty harsh terms. So the nations, the idolaters said, well, look, the sun provides light. So, and the sun is given authority. So let's ask the sun to provide light to us, because Hashem would like the light, the sun, to have its. He doesn't mix into my personal stuff. He's got bigger and better things to worry about. So again, the perception of the distinctive characteristics or individuality, the midos, the measurables of sun and separation and the grasses and whatever it is, and these other forces can be seen as, again, independent of Hashem. And what the Alter Rebbe is emphasizing, that while we are permitted to talk about these things, the chesed of Hashem, the will of Hashem, the vengeance of Hashem, we should never make the mistake of thinking that they exist outside of the infinity of Hashem. Rather, like again with the stencil, it's just filtering the infinite into a tangible bite-sized piece for the benefit of the recipient.